we've got two folks leading the conversation today. Stephanie Galding, who is a managing director at Pharmatech Associates, and Ryan Donahue, who is Redica Systems VP of Sales. So I'm John Folker. I'm our VP of Marketing. I will note that this topic, the cost of quality, is a little bit of a follow-up to a webinar we put on a few weeks ago with former FDA investigator Vin Cafiso. And when I send out the recording of today's webinar to all registrants, which we do as a normal matter, I will include a link to that in case anyone missed it and would like to go back and watch that as well. So with that all said, I'll toss it over to you, Ryan, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, John. So just kind of orient everybody to how this webinar came about. So a little background here. Stephanie and I have known each other for years now. We see each other frequently at conferences. We have lots of conversations, sidebar conversations about what's going on in industry and what we're seeing. So we thought it made sense to John's point, to have a follow-up to the webinar we did about a month ago with Vin, which I thought was extremely great as well, very informative. And that one really kind of covered what are the cost to being reactionary versus proactive. And so Stephanie and I started talking about this back in September at the PDA FDA joint conference. And so we thought, you know what, let's just do a webinar about this. And let's talk about what is the true cost of quality and how you equate that to how you set up your quality systems, how you do your training, how you create your processes to then be more proactive versus that reactive way of looking at the cost of quality. So, Stephanie and I have talked about this. Stephanie has got great experience doing this, helping customers, helping folks in industry all over the world, really. And so, I think what we're going to do is really make this more conversational. We're going to try to address as many of these the questions that you all submitted. We might not get to everything because honestly, Stephanie and I can talk for hours, and we might just actually end up doing a follow-up webinar to this to address some of those questions we didn't get to. But we're going to try to keep this on rails as much as we can, but we want to make it very conversational. So, Stephanie, did I do a good job of kind of teeing that up, or
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm happy to be here with you. Happy to continue the conversations we've been having offline and to share the conversation, I think, with a wider group as well, because it certainly is a topic that comes up, and Ben's webinar is fantastic. So if you didn't watch it, didn't see it live, didn't have a chance to ask questions, certainly go back, watch the recording. I was fortunate enough, I got to watch him live, and he does a really great job at talking about reactive and the costs associated with that, and takes you through some pretty good examples of what that kind of looks like. But as Ryan, as you and I have talked about, when you start to look at this, there's always this two-side scale, and kind of we took this into the larger cost of quality conversation, which is about both the cost of investing in good quality, as well as that what we often refer to as cost of poor quality, right? That reactionary space that clearly in the questions came through in a lot of spaces. I think a lot of folks are maybe dealing with that on a day-to-day basis in the companies that they're working for. So I think we're teed up pretty good. And if you're okay, I think I'd like to start, just in case folks aren't super familiar with cost of quality, because that'll kind of weave in and out of a lot of these kind of conversations about being proactive and why you be proactive. I've got two real simple slides I'd like to share with the group, just to kind of form that basis for launching into our conversation.
Yeah, that'll be helpful. I think this is a great way to just kind of get the conversation kicked off. And like I said before, really kind of keep us on rails so we don't just go, down a bunch of rabbit holes.
All right, perfect. And then once we get through these first two slides, I'll stop sharing so that you can just see Ryan and I having a conversation. But I'd like to kind of start this conversation. I think, Ryan, this is where we talked about after we sat through Ben's webinar, and fundamentally, when you look at cost of quality and people start and very easily talk about poor quality, but sometimes we forget there's also this good quality. And in the quality circles, the total cost of quality is made up of both of those components. It is an investment that you're making in the good quality. And I've got a bigger chart that actually shares that with you guys, as well as looking at the cost of poor quality. We all know what that looks like in our industry. That's deviations, that's recalls, that's responding to 483s, like Vin talked about. Like, we know what that side looks like. But sometimes we forget that when you're starting to talk about that investment in quality, moving towards proactive, you're going to spend time, effort, energy, maybe even money, right, in doing things, implementing systems, implementing processes that are aimed at driving down the equation on the cost of poor quality side. And there's actually a series of big calculations that you can do behind the scenes. I've done this for customers previously. I did this when I was in industry. You can focus on cost of poor quality, or you can look at that balance of spending across the two. But things that typically end up in that good side, what we would classically, or Ryan and I talk about, is that proactive side, typically fall into kind of categories, and that's either prevention, or the more modern nomenclature is becoming investment, right? And what classic COQ terminology talks about is appraisal, and the newer terminology starts to talk about monitoring.
Mm.
So that's what you see on the slide in the four categories, is really new terminology versus legacy cost of quality terminology. And on this investment in good quality side, which is where Ryan and I really want to, I think, kind of talk a bit more about, you're talking about everything from creating a robust QMS, a well-functioning QMS, to investing in risk management technologies and strategies and managing that to avoid things that might come up on the cost of poor quality side. All of that counts as investing in quality, but it's proactive, it's thoughtful, the systems, tools, and processes to drive the business to be constantly on the lookout for things that could either show up as poor quality or be proactive and prevent that from ever happening. So if you're familiar with risk management strategies, right, you've got a process in place that's used to kind of detect signals of potential risks, to get them fed to the right folks to do an evaluation on those and determine, are you just going to monitor and see if we need to do anything, or are you actually going to put, often we call these risk mitigation strategies in place, right? How do you want to prevent that risk from ever manifesting itself, right? A great example is when you start to talk about supply chains and distribution practices. There's a lot of risk management that goes into that. You can control some things, like you can control whether or not you've got sufficient carriers, redundancy built into that, but you can't control the weather, right? But you need to have strategies for when, you have hurricanes or like massive devastation that we saw with Helene in North Carolina and many of the remote regions in the central portion of our country in the last few months. Without robust risk management strategies in place, then you go into what we are all very familiar with. And I think we saw some of this in the questioning, the firefighting, the crisis mode of, oh my gosh, this has now happened. We now have to deal with this. And now we're just like in this downright panic of
Well,
what
that's the reactive side. That's the
that's that
reactive
reactive
side.
side.
Then
The
you're into the
proactive side.
reactive. Yeah.
Yeah,
So on the
that proactive
proactive
side.
side, let
Yeah.
me ask you this, Stephanie. So, in the investment section, which I think is really great, right? Like everybody, when you start to build out your QMS, you have to start thinking about the basics, right? And I think there's a litany of things that everybody knows about. What are the common basics, right? You need to start setting up your systems, your processes, your SOPs, training, etc., right? What is like in your work, what do you see as some of the most common pitfalls that folks make in this investment section, in this investment phase, if you will? And I'm sure it's ongoing always, but like initially, what are some of the biggest mishaps or things that might get overlooked that come to, uh, dare I say, bite people in the butt, but then leads into that side of the cost of poor quality, right? So like, what would you say are some of those big things?
Yeah. So I think some of the biggest things that I see are things like just not, especially in younger companies, startup environments, things like that, not putting in place robust risk management frameworks and really using them as part of the business to help identify those potential issues and kind of it's that signal before the disaster comes, right? It's an early warning system to try and help detect things. I also see challenges where, and I've actually had this conversation a lot with startup organizations. So, working at Pharmatech, we work a lot with startup organizations of a lot of different product modalities. But one of the common questions I get as somebody who's lived her life in quality assurance, quality control, both sides of that equation,
Yep.
is when is the right time to actually pursue an EQMS, and should I pursue an EQMS, or can I do this paper? Well, that answer is yes, you can always do paper. But as I look at today's day and age, I have come to understand the landscape of electronic quality management systems that are out there, and I understand the price range that's out there. You can get one if you're a small company for sometimes as little as $20,000 to $30,000,
Right.
right? For a
Right.
really small organization that's, you know, just maybe tens of people versus hundreds or thousands of people.
Yep.
And yes, there are the big ones that are out there that have large price tags with them that are really great at what they do, but it doesn't mean you have to invest in one of those to be able to do that. So that size of that investment can vary in that investing stage. And I think organizations, for me, like I literally had this conversation earlier this year with a new client of ours that, they were asking the question, we're new, we're small, we're like 10 people total, you know, does it really make sense to do an EQMS, or do we kind of, I hate to put it this way, but basically kind of jerry rig some sort of hybrid traditional paper QMS with like a SharePoint site and, controls and things like that. And the amount of ongoing investment you have to put into maintaining those kind of really hybrid solutions, those types of things. When you start to look at the long-term return on investment for an EQMS solution, even a smaller one that maybe is focused predominantly on document management and training, you're
Right.
early in your startup, maybe that's where you need your focus right now, right?
Right.
So you implement just those pieces. And I think for me, that investment side is often the biggest pitfall is not either implementing the things or not implementing them maybe early enough. And already being in a situation where you're having to deal with a reactive issue and having to go back and say, okay, well, now we're going to go and implement this electronic solution to cover this, or, we
Yeah.
need to redeploy a better training program. Um,
Have you seen like a trend where it's like, hey, okay, at this stage, we should then start looking at investing in this, or at this stage, investing in this. That kind of helps guide folks on where and when to potentially do the investments. And then I'll ask a second question that might lead us down another rabbit hole, which is then how do you get, because this is always a big question, and we got this question right from some of our attendees, is how do you get management to agree to those investments? Because obviously there's going to be some monetary, cost associated with that, right?
yeah, yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to stop the sharing, and I've got multiple
Yeah.
monitors. You know how that goes, right? Um, that way I can see you instead of the slide that I'm looking at.
Yep.
Um, so I think that there is there I get the question a lot, when's the right time to do this, et cetera. And I am of an opinion, and my experience has proven right that um, every company is going to be unique. Every company's life cycle and evolution is going to be unique.
Right.
And so often, and this is where I like spending my time in conversations with clients who are especially in that startup stage is, well, let's take a look at your business. Let's take a look at where you are. Let's take a look at how you're planning on achieving your product development goals. And if commercialization yourself is ultimately your goal, that timing may be sooner rather
Yep.
than later. If you're going to outsource or out-license products at the end of the clinical study, or as you move into pivotal trials, your timing may look a little bit a little bit different, or, frankly, there's nothing wrong with paper. I don't want anybody to walk away from the conversation saying you can't ever do
Got
paper.
to go get an EQMS right
Yeah,
now, or
like
limb system.
not
Yeah.
that's not required. There are plenty of organizations I've worked for in my career that have had really well-tuned paper-based systems. There is I used to call it an overhead, but there is a cost associated with the manual systems versus, as we all know in today's day and age, I've been in industry over 30 years now. When I came into industry, everything was very different. We didn't even have individual computers to work off of.
Yeah.
So we have come a long way that now, typically when you're working in a company, many companies don't, I'm assuming they still exist, but I don't know. But
And to your point, though, there's also always going to be an element of human error. Doesn't matter if you go out and get the latest and greatest, platforms, et cetera, right? Because if the human who's managing that doesn't update it properly, import things properly, et cetera, it's still, you're still going to run into regulatory issues down the road if you're not doing these things. So, but
absolutely.
what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, just to kind of button this up, maybe, is it's all about the processes you put in place and the measures to monitor those processes to make sure that you have everything. And then when you're looking at what that cost is versus the benefit, it's okay, if we're spending X number of hours, for instance, just going back to the whole paper thing, right? If we're spending X number of hours trying to manage things in SharePoint with documents and PDFs and then Excel sheets that we are monitoring tasks and, activity, et cetera, right? That amount of hours that goes into keeping that maintained, updated, and traceable is enormous. Then, the benefit of maybe spending a little extra money to go out and get an EQMS outweighs that at that point, right? So is that right? I mean, is that what you're kind of?
That is exactly what I'm talking about. And that to me is the core essence of when you're starting to look at that overall cost of quality and focusing in on the good quality, being proactive about this, being intentional about how you're designing your systems and infrastructure so that, yes, you're never going to completely eliminate things like human error. It does happen. There's certain categories of human error that do happen, but you can take those human factors, design around them to try and minimize their chance of occurrence. And then ultimately what you're doing on that investment side, because that's all investing, is minimizing the chance of issues that would actually be calculated in a calculation under a cost of poor quality side. So
How do
that's
you,
that balance.
how have you worked with customers in the past to understand, like, okay, here's the deal. You're seeing this from a trending perspective from industry based on, let's just say FDA inspections, and the enforcement actions. You know, this is where you really need to start looking at your systems and potentially being, not up to snuff, because this is a new trend, or this is the trend that we're seeing from industry, from the health authorities.
Yeah. So part of, for me, that prevention, right, being proactive is staying current on what's going on. And as well as I do, and I've come and talked with you guys before and presented on other topics. I'm a huge fan of investing in regulatory intelligence and monitoring and understanding that landscape that's going on, because things can shift. Yes, we can all go out there and you can actually analyze the data directly from the FDA if you really want to spend the time to do it. But there are people out there that look at top 10 reports and things like that. So you can understand kind of massive trends.
Yeah.
But what's often interesting is kind of being able to dive down and dissect into, because for instance, almost a perennial topic in sterile products is sterility assurance,
Yep.
right? Big umbrella category. But the reality is it aseptic processing? Is it environmental monitoring? Is there some sort of contamination control? Like, what is it about it that's actually driving the trend? And often over time, we see it swing through. And so if you're not um, involving yourself in understanding what those trends are, and whether that's through your own research, through going to conferences, through any means you can get that information,
Yep.
then you can't prepare for them. And I have seen clients get hit with a 483 in an FDA inspection where
Yeah.
I've seen the trend. I've even talked to them, knowing them well enough, right? That, hey, I'm seeing this trend. You might want to take a look at these systems because we've talked about some of these issues. This could come bite you in the next inspection. You might want to take action now
Yeah.
and not have what Vin talked about in the last webinar, a 483, and having to deal with the response and all the costs associated with it, and that price tag that goes with it. And
Yeah.
that conversation is not always an easy one to have, because sometimes there are, um, especially in management, sometimes I hate to say it this way, but there's sometimes people like to be in what I call a firefighting mode.
Yeah.
Which is if
Yeah.
you're not paying attention to those trends, typically what you're going to do, they like to have the fire crop up, go put it out, and kind of move on to the next one. There are people out there that absolutely love that.
Yep.
I am a person that would way more try and prevent the issues because the issues around that reactive side tend to drain an organization. It can burn out the people. It can do all
Mm,
kinds of things. It causes chaos sometimes within an organization. All of a sudden, instead of focusing on normal manufacturing, normal testing, normal getting product to patients, because that's all what we do in our industry space, we're now focused on fighting fires.
yeah. Yeah.
And I worked in a company where I thought my job at one point was a professional firefighter.
Wow. That's interesting. I never thought about that. The burnout and the people I thought was a really good comment you just made. Like, there is nothing that will drain somebody more than having to be reactionary
All
all
the time.
the time versus just going, hey, I see this. Why can't we do anything about it now? And I'm sure everybody on this call is probably thinking, well, Ryan asked that question because he's talking about Redica and what Redica provides, which, yes, we do provide that type of data. But the real reason I'm asking that is because when you look at that, if you pull your slide back up, if you look at that investment prevention section that you were talking about, there's, variation reduction, lessons learned, training, qualification, and validation. And how do you do all of that? Um, you know, you've got your own internal data, but you've also got this slew of external data that's sitting out there that can really help you understand, especially if you're just getting started, where you don't have as much as your own internal data as you'd like to really be able to make, you know, informed business decisions. Why not use what's available out there to help with your training programs, to use lessons learned from other observations or other 43s that other organizations have received who look exactly like you guys, right? Or, the qualification and validation when you're looking at potential new CDMOs that you're going to work with or CROs, what type of information do you have on them if you've never worked with them to actually go and do that validation or that qualification? So I feel like there's a lot in this investment section that, there's a lot you can do up front that is available out there that I think people just don't think you need it right away. But in all actuality, if you did do this earlier, you're gonna be setting yourself up for success so much sooner than having to deal with all these headaches later.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think that investment piece is probably the most important piece, and it's the one that I think most organizations often struggle with is when and where is the right time to make an investment? How big of an investment do I need to make? Um, and
Well,
often,
that goes back to that second question, right?
yeah,
That I threw out there. How do we get management to agree and approve either the spend or the resources, whatever that may be? How have you found it best to go do that? Because I think that, again, that is like the overarching biggest question I think we received, or the most common
because we,
question.
I think
And
we
then
got it in like 15 different forms. So
well, and you get it all the time with your
yeah,
customers. I get
yeah,
it all the time with my customers. How do you help me get this approved, right? Like, and that's my goal is to help people get our data in their hands, right?
yeah.
And same for you. So how do you do that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I have found successful, and there's probably a whole host of other folks that will be out there to tell you, do this and this will happen, and do this and this will happen. But I boil it down into kind of three big things that if you're going to make a pitch for whether it's I want to implement an EQMS solution, or I'd like access to Redica, or I'd like to implement a full risk management program, whatever it is you're trying
Yeah.
to do. um,
Everybody listening, she's going to lay out her three things. So jot these
yeah,
down. I'm
These are
ready.
the three important things is one, at the very beginning, as a person who is passionate about bringing this change forward in your company, is and securing an investment from your management team, is understand who you're pitching to.
Hmm.
Is oftentimes, and I've fallen victim to this myself in the early days until I learned how important this actually was, is that some management teams are comprised of themselves at even the top uppermost levels, people who are actually in and of themselves a core, a firefighter. They love fighting the fires. Like they don't see anything wrong with it.
Mhm.
I'm gonna tell you right now, if you've got that kind of management team, it is a much harder conversation to get through because they're not going to see an issue with where you are today. And
Mhm.
sometimes the way to counteract that is through conversations, is through education, is see if you can get someone like me to come in who's not maybe associated with the industry, but has worked across, I think in over 10 years of consulting, I've worked with over 75 different clients. Like you see a lot in what I do. And when you can come saying, well, yes, I've seen this, and these are the clear consequences of it versus sometimes speculating about what that actually looks like.
Yep.
That educational process itself can take some time, but you also have to know that maybe if they really are that firefighter. I have sometimes said, I would love to do this, but this is not the right time. This is not the right management team to do this. But take stock of your management team because people come and go. Right? We all would love to think that we work for one company. And,
Right.
I grew up and my parents, that's what they did. They went and worked at a company and they retired from that company. Right.
Yeah.
That is not where we are today. People move around. So your management team may change and you may get a different player in play.
Yeah.
Um,
So
but
know your audience.
know your audience.
Know your audience. Know what they care about,
Know what they care about,
and
and
you
know what
can
they value.
associate that. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
know what they value.
All right. What's
Um,
number?
Number two is invest the time necessary to build a strong business case.
Okay. What does
And
that look like?
especially if you're in a quality role and your job is to release product, or maybe you're seeing this down on a lower level of a larger, more complex organization, or even in a smaller organization, we often don't spend the time translating an investment
Yeah. Yeah.
to,
I think I get that. What would
yeah,
be an example of how you would do that?
yeah. So business case, why do we need this? What is a return on investment going to be? So what do we think the investment's going to cost us? So I like picking on an EQMS because there's actually a lot of data and a lot of research. And trust me, if you're in this boat right now where you're trying to convince your management team to go after an EQMS solution, just start asking, get on Google, ask a few questions. A lot of them actually have tools that are available that drive into research that have been done by research organizations about the potential cost savings associated with implementing a full EQMS solution. So we're talking doc management, training, management deviation, CAPA's nonconformances, change management, audit management, you know, the more broad, the more holistic that approach is, the often the larger the savings are. But understand how it's going to impact your organization. Are you talking about efficiencies of processes? Are you talking about you know, I was actually having this conversation earlier today in in a company meeting, and somebody asked if I wanted to be copied on an email. And no, I don't want to be copied on an email. Do you know what my inbox looks like? There's those kind of things that sometimes the advantage of a platform is that as a worker, instead of going to email and getting these signals from 15 different sources, I go to a platform and I get all my signals of everything I need to do.
Yep.
Right. And so there's savings that come from that ongoing use. There's data and power in analytics. I think most of us understand. And this is one of the things that I love about good EQMSs, but I also love about your particular product is the analytics that come with this are strong. They allow you to look at trends. They allow you to look and see what's happening in your own organization. And for example, a deviation and CAPA process is an interesting space because when you go through that investigation and determining those CAPAs, you're in the cost of poor quality side.
Correct.
Right. But as soon as you actually go to implement the preventative actions, not just corrections or corrective actions, but you go implement those preventative actions, the things that are designed to prevent things from happening, all of a sudden you are now chasing good quality, cost of good quality. You're chasing an investment to be made. And so I think being able to articulate what about this affects the downstream business.
Yep.
And it's not, I see a lot of folks try and go at this of, it's an industry standard, or it's, the health authority is going to expect this. Well, I'm here to tell you that's actually not necessarily the case. Yes, it may be industry standard. That may be factual. We see a lot of companies with EQMS platforms.
Right.
But there are also just as many that are out there that are still functioning happily on a paper-based system.
Okay.
So, and the health authorities don't actually mandate that you have to have an EQMS. What they mandate is that you have to have a quality management system. You can choose the format. So it's about, to me, building that business case of why does our business need this? What are we going to gain from this business? And putting a true story around this investment. And it starts by knowing costs, knowing what we're going to get out of it, knowing what we're going to achieve in the long run, what are short-term gains versus long-term gains. And I know probably some of our attendees are probably going, oh my God, she wants me to think about all this stuff. But the reality is, if you're presenting upwards to management, this is what matters.
Yeah, exactly.
This is the way they think. They think in business lingo, not necessarily what, especially those of us who come from either quality assurance, quality control type spaces. We don't always think in those terms, but that's the terms management thinks in. So we have to learn how to speak their language.
Yeah, totally. Again, that goes to knowing your audience also.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay. So that's number two.
That's number two. And the third piece involves one of my favorite things, which is active listening. The third piece is actually about listening to what their concerns are.
Wait, what was that?
Active listening.
I wasn't
Listening
listening.
to their concern. Yeah, it's a great example, Ryan, right? So listen to what their concerns are. But to listen and hear their concerns, you should be there not trying to formulate a response, but actually going, okay, I hear that. Now, if I hear what you're saying correctly, you say your concern is this, and reflect that back to them.
Yeah.
Right. Make sure that you're walking away from a conversation and not feel like you have to address the concern right there in the meeting, but say, hey, I want to take this back. Let me do a little bit more research. Let me pull together and let's revisit this. But a lot of times people don't actually get to the root of what the concern coming from an individual on the management team is, or maybe individuals on the management team, and you're never going to get through something if you can't address those
Well,
concerns.
so let me rephrase that, right? So if I'm hearing you correctly, right, what I think you're saying is if you're listening to respond versus listening to understand, you're not actually listening to what the root cause of management is saying they care about. What is the root cause of the business result they're trying to achieve, right? So if you can deduce by listening to what that true root cause is that they're trying to solve, then you understand how to frame your response or help in that regard. And that can then gain you the knowledge to know how to build the business case. And then again, helps you understand your audience, right? So it just kind of trails back up to the 3 points that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
it's a great paraphrase. It's exactly what it is. You're listening to respond, not listening to understand.
Okay. Okay. So we've spent the first 35 minutes on the investment piece, right?
Yep.
Okay. So anything else you want to make sure we touch on with the investment piece before we move to maybe say the monitoring or
Yeah, I think we've covered a pretty good ground there. I'm sure if we have missed something, somebody will ask a question.
yeah.
But I think that touches the big ticket questions that we saw in the questions that came in with the registrations.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
maybe it's
Yeah,
time.
that touches on quite a few of them, right? So when we wrap this up, there's a few questions that I want to throw out there from the audience too. But
Perfect.
you know, when we're talking about the appraisal piece, because again, if you pull up your slide again, there's the investment, then there's the monitoring, and then we get into the cost of poor quality. But what I want to make sure is we spend most of our time talking about this cost of good quality section. So the monitoring piece. Okay, let's dive into this real quick.
Absolutely. So the monitoring piece really comes from all of the processes that you put in place, such as things like incoming inspection on raw materials and components, in-process testing, final product inspection and testing. All of that is technically classified as good quality. It's monitoring.
Okay.
Uh, right. It's designed to detect if there's an issue where you don't meet your specifications. But also things like calibration programs, preventative maintenance, right? We see a lot, and I've probably seen it in our industry over the last 10 to 15 years, more focus on preventative maintenance programs, and that being one of the fundamental things that can actually drive up OEE and drive down downtime in an organization that's a manufacturing facility, is having equipment that functions well, that's not going to break on you. Those types of pieces are all part of monitoring, but probably one of my most favorite pieces of monitoring, and one of probably sometimes the most underlooked pieces, is actually your auditing programs.
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So in a really robust, especially internal auditing program,
Mhm.
what you're actually supposed to be doing is not just do the am I following my procedures checks, right? That's one thing.
Okay.
But where am I against current expectations? So we go back to the conversation we were having on prevention and regulatory intelligence. Can you understand the trends that are going on out there in industry?
Mm.
Well, if I hear that one, and I'm just going to pick on this because it came up a lot in the PDA FDA conference that we were at in September, right? That one of the latest and greatest trends in inspections in 483 is really a focus on aseptic processing controls, right?
Mhm.
That's still an issue. I've seen probably more observations in the last few years around smoke studies than I've ever seen, right? So maybe that's an area where I'm going to feed that signal into my auditing program and say, okay, I'm going to go audit our sterility assurance program, but I'm going to focus in on these hot topics, do deep dives into them. And maybe instead of using our internal staff, maybe I choose to invest in using a consultant who's a sterility assurance guru to come in
Mhm.
and actually look at this with an objective, unbiased set of eyes. Because sometimes what I find with auditing programs is we use the same auditors over and over and over and over. And what naturally happens to us, we get blinders on. I mean, it's just a part of being a human that we get blinders put on and we stop seeing things. Right. So sometimes the ability to inject new eyes into a process can be very valuable as part of that process and allow you to identify an issue before it either adversely impacts product, putting you back on that cost of poor quality side, or becomes an issue in an inspection, which definitely puts you on that cost of poor quality side.
So how do you establish that? Like how do you establish that baseline or understand what is being cited that then we can say, okay, this is where we know issues are happening from an overall industry perspective or specific to our subset of the industry. And and how do we take the proper measures, do proper, root cause analysis or CAPAs or whatever, right? How do you attack that?
Yeah, so I think really this is going to go back to your ability to look for and detect the signals out there in the industry. Your guys' system is certainly well known for its capabilities to do a lot of this. But I think there's also just the advent of building networks. One of the things that I didn't understand, in the really early days of my career, as I moved into quality assurance and out of quality control space and started to learn about being a QA person and what did that really take and what did it really mean. But I didn't understand how important it was to understand what was going on in other companies, what was going on in inspections, kind of with somebody else raising the bar, because we all talk about CGMPs. They're never the same. There's always a little bit of a bar nudge that kind of keeps going up and up and up over the years.
Mhm.
Where's the bar currently? What is the current expectation? What's the current um, not even best practice, but the base practice that's expected? It's not the way it was when I came into industry. I can guarantee you that. It's just
Yeah.
not, right?
Yeah.
Where the world is different, our controls are different, our manufacturing facilities are different. And so when we look at that space of staying current, it takes effort. And it takes either a person or a combination of persons and systems to do it. And I can tell you, having done and tried to develop those kind of external trend gathering programs probably 15 years ago, I mean, it can be a team of people that's just nonstop doing that. And I see that in a lot of clients today that, they're investing in resources to monitor a bunch of sources and understand what's going on and to try and get that data. But when you look at inspectional data, we all know that Redica's got the largest set of 43 information in it.
Yep.
There is not anybody else out there who has a larger set of 43 data. Um,
Yep.
and so to me, being able to lean into that kind of data to say, okay, you guys have done the due diligence, you've requested all kinds of 43s, you've got warning letters in there, you've got all this data. And, I'm not sure if everybody on the call is super familiar with your platform or not, but, the ability and the analytics that you've now built into the platform behind your tagging structures and a lot of that other stuff that have been an evolution over the last 5 to 6 years makes it extremely powerful to quickly dissect, hey, I'm in sterility assurance. This is the major categories. I want to zoom in on EM programs because maybe I have some signals coming from my own deviation and CAPA evaluations that say, maybe this isn't where it needs to be. What other issues do I need to look out for? And then you're going to plan an investment in upgrading your EM program, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that monitoring piece and the trend piece and the auditing piece kind of all start to come together in terms of being able to go back and kind of develop that. What are we going to do as an investment? What are we going to do as a prevention measure to prevent
Yeah.
being in a bad
Well,
space, a reactive
and
space?
and to your point, right? Like what you were just calling out around smoke studies, right? I just popped into our platform and I can see
Yeah.
that, under, production citations, literally the most common over the last 5 years, or actually I'll just share my screen real quick.
Yeah.
When you're looking at production citations, which, is where smoke studies would fall under from a human drugs GMP quality system standpoint,
Yep.
you can see here that sterile products, which is exactly where smoke studies would live, is the number one citation for production citations, right?
Yep.
So, and by far, like almost 50, well, for 2024 alone, it's just 50%, right? So understanding what is the trend when there is a large trend like this over the last 3 years, it's really screaming at everybody, be prepared in this area because that's where they're gonna key in on,
Yeah.
right? So why not take this, take it in a level deeper and understand what's being cited, right? So that you can then set up the proper training programs, the proper SOPs, understand where you might have issues. What's your CAPAs around these that you're performing? What's the root cause that you're doing to help you stay on top of these? And again, it's all over the board, right? And these are the main, observations that are being set forth around
Yeah.
production.
And you can see this first line. I mean, production design to prevent microbiological contamination of drug products. That's part of their standard language that when they're
Yeah.
writing those citations is going to
The
appear.
43 turbo language. Right, right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right. But when you start to actually, and in your case, instead of, and I love the fact that the FDA does make the data fully transparent. But they do redact it. There is a short version that's available through their dashboard.
Yep.
Uh, but you guys will actually go request and pull in the full 43s, and you can actually take a look at the actual full context of the observation, minus any redacted information that comes through the FOIA process. But
Yep.
the ability to again, this is what I talk about when I talk about analytics around this kind of stuff and the power that analytics has today.
Yep.
That 10 years ago, even we were not in a position to do this. Any of this kind of stuff would have taken man months to do. I mean,
Oh
just
yeah.
100%.
If
So
you could even get the data, right? Like, and that's a big if, right?
yes,
So, I mean,
yes,
and then you see things like this, right? Process validation inadequate or missing. Like, what? How do we make sure that we don't get that type of observation? Because you're talking massive, then you're getting into that reactive where you start talking about massive dollars spent in remediation, right? So I get it. I think again, to your point, there's a lot that our customers can that our industry can do to help shore up any of those potential issues. But
Yeah.
ahead of
Yeah.
time, by the way, ahead of time.
Ahead of time. And I think that that's sometimes what we may miss in some of those conversations, going back to the how do I convince management, right?
Yeah,
Is, you know, I couldn't have 10 years ago pulled together a case that could have included that kind of data.
right.
50% of the 483 observations over the last 3 years have been in sterile products, and, kind of being able to break that down.
Yeah,
And we have this same issue. Like, all of a sudden now you can say, not only this is a trend, we know that in this case, the FDA is focusing on this particular topic, but we have this issue. Our internal audits are telling us we have this issue. We've gone and looked, and they say, yes, this issue is here. We need to fix this. Like, we don't want to wait to be told to fix
right.
it. And I know that there are some management teams that are out there that, again, sometimes they're the firefighter kind. They want to wait to be told. Um, you know, if that's not a mode that you're comfortable in, that may be a different thought process or decision you may want to go through. But
Yeah,
I think in many of those cases, being able to lay out that as part of, we talked about building a case for an investment, whether it's an investment in a QMS or it's an investment in a program upgrade, right? It's being able to make that translate to the implications for the business, and to show them that this is what it is. And the thing, again, I love about your system is I can actually go pull the full observation context. And I've
right.
done this with some customers. I've gone in and pulled out an observation context that's
Yeah,
exemplar of an issue that I observed in their
right.
system. So when I do a gap assessment, I will sometimes provide a little bit of an insight. Like, if you were to see this in a 483, this is what it would look like, and this is what it would mean. And then this is what you're typically going to look at in terms of costs to fix this
Yeah,
versus
that's what I was gonna get.
spending.
Yes.
Maybe instead of spending, what did Vin say? Over $1 million, something like that, for your
On a 43. And
on
he
a
said,
single observation,
and
or
sometimes one observation, right?
one
Exactly. Yeah,
one observation. And I would probably question that that's not the big multi-part observations.
right.
Like you mentioned, we were in one of our conversations, we were talking about an observation around missing a quality unit, and it just dumbfounds both of us that companies are out there and they're completely missing a quality unit. Well, it's yes, it does happen. It is a little bit shocking to me still that does happen, but the cost of fixing that is well over $1 million. Like, that's not a small fix. But I
No.
think when you start to look at these kinds of pieces, you can actually integrate them back into the business case and say, listen, we've got this. And that's what I do with those gap assessments. I provide them all that context. And it's almost like this is what you'd pay now to start to invest in fixing it, versus this is what it could cost you if you wait until it becomes an issue downstream.
To that point, just, I know we were having this conversation and I thought this would be fun to pull up too. Quality
Yeah.
unit missing
Yep.
is a real thing.
Oh, it is.
It's a real problem. Like, I wasn't joking with you when I said that, last week when we were talking about this, because I was like, am I right? Have I really actually seen that a lot? And it is
Oh, yeah.
very common for
Yeah.
quality system citations, right? It is extremely common. It dumbfounds me. It literally dumbfounds me
Yeah.
that this is still an issue in our industry today. Look, there is no quality control unit, right? Like,
Yeah.
how? And it's happening in 2024,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's not like this isn't happening. This was something of the past. But anyway, okay, I'm gonna move on. All right, because
Yeah.
we can chew this one up for a while. We did get a question that came in through. I wanna address this because I think this is a really great question. So whoever submitted this, thank you. So it says, what I see a lot, specifically from quality control, they want to waste more in the name of quality. How do we measure the benefits of this and find that balance?
Yeah. So there are ways to actually do calculations behind the scenes. I've done this when I worked in industry in the last probably 5 years or so, we ran and collected data and did some actual calculations. And if you're collecting that data on a regular basis, then you can actually run scenarios and say, okay, I invest in this particular change, this amount, this is what the total investment looks like. And you can predict potentially, what you think that's going to impact on the cost of poor quality side. Because usually you spend money on this side, it's less than it would be on the cost of poor quality side, and you're reducing that side. So it's usually a investment triggers a reduction.
Mhm.
So, one thing I want to be clear in the conversation is there's always a cost of quality, right? Which is why it's comprised of good quality and bad quality.
Correct.
The ranges vary across industries pretty widely, but on average, most companies, when you look at it as a percentage of sales, they're somewhere in the 15 to 20% of their sales revenue.
Yep.
So you don't want to tip really significantly necessarily in one direction or another over the long term. You may have short-term tips in your cost of good quality, but that should pay you back year over year in reductions in poor quality. And I think when we look at this space, it's a challenge to kind of come in and say, for many people to look at determining what that actual cost is and the impact in that full calculation. There are people that I know that are like gurus of cost of quality analysis.
Yeah.
That have spent their entire careers going into companies and helping them think through some of these things, implementing programs that actually look at cost of quality on an ongoing basis. But I think when we're looking at the question that came in terms of, refresh my memory, he said the question was around quality control making.
Yeah. They want to spend more in the name of quality. And how do you measure the benefits of this and find that balance? So I think the hard part is if you're investing in quality up front, how do you know or how do you show the benefits of that from a cost perspective if you're eliminating the actual having to do the reactive piece, right? The cost of poor quality. How do you show that?
Yeah, so there are two primary ways. One is what I call the big calculation, the cost of quality calculations, running through those. And really to actually use that methodology that really involves kind of instituting a program where you're actually doing the initial investment to measure the cost of quality as it stands today. And then you can actually run through a scenario where you could say, well, quality control wants to go do this, and it's in the name of quality, but the questions, and you get into really granular conversations. Is this changing headcount? Is this changing throughput in the lab? Is this changing, the batch release cycle time in any way? So you're gonna go through a whole litany of kind of questions around that kind of stuff. So there's that way of kind of going about that. But for many companies, especially smaller organizations, that is not something that I would necessarily recommend investing a large amount of time in doing, because it's a complex calculation. It requires maintenance. It requires a lot of data mining. And if your systems aren't set up to pull that data really well, then it becomes a whole different series of conversations. But I think when you're talking about in the name of quality, and I'm making an assumption, maybe this person is somebody who is getting those kind of requests. Well, they're saying they want to do this in the name of quality. Well, again, maybe be the bad cop. If you're familiar with the six thinking hats, there's a black hat that's kind of like a devil's advocate hat. Put that on and ask a lot of questions about, what do you see this impacting down the road? Is this going to change our throughput in the lab? Is this going to change how quickly we can get things to QA and affect the overall batch release cycle time, the ability to get our product to the customers? What is this really actually going to change for the organization to make it? Because what you're typically looking at from an investment perspective is making things run better, efficiently, and with fewer errors. What errors is this trying to reduce? Ask those questions, because if the person who's coming, and again, if you're at a company that's bigger and you've got layers of management, typically you go to your manager with an idea. It's okay to ask those questions to start to get that that thought process going, and maybe you help the person with that thought process if you're in a larger organization. If you're in a smaller organization, you may be on the leadership team and you may want those answers directly, and just start that dialogue to understand and get beyond in the vein of quality. Yet quality gets to my opinion, a little bit of a bad moniker in some organizations, that it's a bad thing. No, quality has been around for ages. It is present in every industry. I'm actually on the board of directors at ASQ, and the thing I have seen in that community is it doesn't matter whether you're talking financial services, pharmaceutical, medical device, customer service, manufacturing airplanes, aviation, space, and defense. I mean, education, quality practices are deployed in every industry.
Yeah, I think that's changing a lot. I think that, the whole premise of quality has really become part and parcel at the forefront of what it is everybody's trying to do, which is create the greatest products with the highest quality standards. And in our industry, right, it's about saving patient lives, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't have the highest standards of quality, you know, it's now becoming such a big conversation. I think that having chief quality officers a seat at the executive table, right? I mean, that's really where I think this is becoming a much bigger topic and much more focus and emphasis put on. So I do believe that some of the folks here who might have trouble with their senior leadership about getting it's understanding, going back to your 3 points, understand your audience, invest time to build a business case, active listening. If we're doing that, we're going to reach people. They're going to hear us a lot more, I think. Because I think that again, it has become a much more accepted business unit in our industry.
Well, and I think you and I had talked in prep for this webinar, and you hadn't asked the question, but I'm going to throw it in there in the last couple of minutes that we're here. But this is also, I think, where the FDA is going, and in particular, CEDAR is going, because the FDA is made up of lots of parts and pieces.
Right.
But where CEDAR is going with their QMM program,
Yes.
right? So the QMM program that they're piloting this year is really designed and aimed at encouraging adoption of quality practices, advancing quality management within an organization. And so when it you pull it into this conversation, understanding that that's where they're going, and that maybe that bottom of the line, that bare minimum compliance is not going to be something that is going to get you where you need to be. That I think is something that is worth kind of thinking through, with worth understanding. And maybe that's part of having those discussions if you're connected to an executive team or part of an executive team, to be able to start to say, where are we in this space? Are we functioning in a space where we're focused on the bare minimum stuff we got to do? Or are we focused on investing in quality because it's the right thing to do for the patients who are at the end of the line?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's again, as I mentioned, there's a lot more questions we didn't get to. And
Yeah.
we literally have 1 minute left. We could go way deeper on the QMM piece, which I would really love to do, by the way, because I think it is big. It's not a small thing. There's some other stuff we could be talking about. There's a lot of changes coming to our industry potentially. So would
Yeah.
love to get your take on that. We could have a long conversation about that as well. But, you know, um, I love having these conversations with you, Stephanie. They're always fun. They're always educating. I love hearing your take on this stuff. Because I do think you bring a lot of experience to the table. You've been in a lot of these conversations, and it can just help our audience. Um, thank you everybody to listening in. If we didn't get to your question, we're going to do it. We might just do another webinar. We'll make sure you're there. But John,
Yeah.
what
Yeah,
else?
I'm back. That means the music is playing you guys off. I would say thank you guys. Thank you everyone for joining. We do publish a lot of great content on a really regular basis. So go to redica.com/blog. You'll see a sign up for our newsletter button. That's the signal which comes out just twice a month, so it won't clutter your inbox. I do encourage everyone to sign up for that. That's the best way to find out about what are the newest blog posts, webinars, etc., that we've put out there. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye for now, and thank you to everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
everybody.
much.
Thanks, Steph.
Bye.
Bye.